The Dog Who Waited, a heartwarming story of loyalty and love. Part 1, The Beginning. The morning sun painted the sky in soft hues of gold and pink as the small town slowly came to life. Birds chirped from the rooftops, and the faint aroma of freshly baked bread drifted through the crisp air. The narrow streets, lined with cozy houses and white picket fences, led to a little blue home at the end of Maple Street. Inside, a boy named Tommy, barely 10 years old, laced up his sneakers while his best friend, Buddy, a golden retriever with warm brown eyes, waited eagerly by the door. "Come on, Buddy, let's go." Tommy grinned as he swung his backpack over his shoulders. Buddy barked excitedly, his tail wagging like a little golden blur. This was their daily routine, walking to school together, side by side, as if they were inseparable. As they stepped outside, the crisp morning breeze ruffled Tommy's hair. Buddy trotted proudly beside him, his paws tapping lightly against the pavement. The neighbors smiled at the sight, waving as the two passed by. "Good morning, Tommy, and hello, Buddy," called Mrs. Miller, the elderly baker, from her shop window. "Morning, Mrs. Miller," Tommy replied, and Buddy gave a happy bark in response. They reached the corner where Tommy usually stopped. The school was only a few blocks away, but Buddy wasn't allowed past this point. He always knew when to wait. "All right, Buddy, you know the drill," Tommy said, crouching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Stay here, okay? I'll be back soon." Buddy sat obediently, though his eyes followed Tommy longingly as he walked away. Tommy turned back one last time and waved. "See you after school, Bud." Buddy wagged his tail, then lay down on the sidewalk, his head resting on his paws. He would wait, just like he always did. That afternoon, as Tommy ran home, Buddy was already there, waiting at the same spot. As soon as he saw the boy, he jumped up, his tail wagging uncontrollably. "See, I told you I'd be back," Tommy laughed, hugging Buddy tightly. The two raced home together, laughter and barks filling the air. Inside, Tommy's mother watched them from the window, a gentle smile on her face. "They really are inseparable, aren't they?" she murmured. But that evening, everything changed. At dinner, Tommy's father cleared his throat, setting down his fork. His expression was serious, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk," he said. Tommy glanced at his mother, then back at his father. "What is it?" His father sighed. "I got a new job. It's in the city. We're moving next month." Tommy's heart sank. He looked down at Buddy, who was happily chewing on his favorite toy, oblivious to the conversation. "But what about Buddy?" Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. His mother reached for his hand. "Sweetheart, we won't be able to take him with us. The apartment doesn't allow pets." Tommy felt a lump in his throat. "No, that's not fair. Buddy's family. We can't just leave him." His father's expression softened, but his decision was final. "We'll find him a good home, Tommy. Someone who can take care of him." Tommy shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. He looked at Buddy, who was still blissfully unaware of what was happening. As the weight of reality settled in, Tommy knew one thing for certain. He had to find a way to say goodbye. Part 2. The Farewell. The days passed too quickly, each one bringing Tommy closer to the inevitable goodbye. He tried not to think about it, but every time he looked at Buddy, his best friend, his shadow, it felt like a knot tightening in his chest. Buddy, unaware of the coming change, continued his daily routine. He still walked Tommy to the corner every morning, still waited patiently for him after school, still curled up at the foot of his bed every night. To Buddy, nothing had changed, but Tommy knew better. One evening, just a few days before the move, Tommy sat on the porch steps, staring up at the sky. The summer air was warm, the stars flickering like distant fireflies. Buddy lay beside him, his head resting on Tommy's knee. "I don't know how to leave you, Buddy," Tommy whispered, running his fingers through the dog's soft fur. "I don't want to." Buddy licked Tommy's hand, his tail thumping gently against the wooden floor. The next morning, Tommy's parents took him to meet a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Miller, the baker from town. She had always adored Buddy and had agreed to take him in. "I promise I'll take good care of him," she assured Tommy, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. But Tommy couldn't bring himself to say yes. The night before the move, he lay awake for hours, Buddy curled up beside him. The thought of leaving in the morning without him was unbearable. So, before the sun even rose, Tommy made a decision. He quietly slipped out of bed, got dressed, and crept downstairs.
"Come on, Buddy," he whispered.
The dog perked up, his tail wagging as he followed Tommy out the door. Tommy led him down the familiar path, the same one they walked every morning. The streets were empty, the air cool with the promise of dawn. They reached the old wooden bench near the school corner, the very spot where Buddy always waited for him. Tommy knelt down and hugged Buddy tightly.
"I have to go now," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I'll come back for you, I promise."
Buddy tilted his head, sensing the sadness in his best friend's voice. Tommy reached into his pocket and pulled out his favorite red bandana, the one he always wore on their adventures. Carefully, he tied it around Buddy's neck. "This means I'll always be with you," he said, brushing away his tears. Buddy licked Tommy's face, his tail wagging as if reassuring him that everything would be okay. Tommy stood up, took one last look at his best friend, and turned away. Buddy sat there, watching as Tommy disappeared down the road.
And then, just like every morning, Buddy did what he always did.
He waited. Part 3. The Waiting Years. The first day without Tommy was confusing for Buddy. He sat at their usual spot, ears perked up, tail wagging expectantly. Every time a child passed by, his head lifted, eyes searching, hoping to see Tommy running toward him. But Tommy never came. As the days turned into weeks, Buddy continued his daily routine. Every morning he would trot to the corner and sit patiently, watching the road. In the afternoons he would return to their house, curling up on the porch, his eyes always glancing toward the horizon. People in town began to notice. Mrs. Miller, the kind baker, would leave out a bowl of water and scraps of bread for him. Mr. Johnson, the old postman, would give him a pat on the head as he passed by. Even the children who walked to school grew used to seeing Buddy at his post, always waiting. "He's still waiting for that boy," Mrs. Miller would say, shaking her head with a mix of admiration and sadness. Seasons changed, but Buddy remained the same. In the summer, he lay in the shade of the old oak tree, his tongue hanging out in the heat. In the fall, he curled up in a bed of golden leaves, his fur blending with the earth. When winter came, snow covered the streets, but Buddy still sat at his spot, shivering, his breath fogging in the cold air. Mrs. Miller tried to take him in during the worst of the winter storms. "Come inside, Buddy," she pleaded, wrapping a blanket around him. Buddy would warm up for a while, but the moment the door opened, he would trot back outside, returning to his place at the corner. The red bandana Tommy had tied around his neck became worn and faded, but Buddy never lost it. It was his last link to his best friend. Years passed. Buddy grew older, his once golden fur turned grey around his muzzle, his movements slower, his eyes a little dimmer. But he never stopped waiting. Even when his legs ached, even when he was too tired to run, he would still make his way to their spot every morning, watching the road, hoping that one day Tommy would return. And then one day, 10 years after that last goodbye, something changed. Buddy lifted his head. A familiar scent carried on the wind, a scent he had not smelled in years. His old heart pounded. His tail gave a slow, weak wag. And then from down the road he saw him.
"Tommy!"
All grown up, but still the same. Buddy's ears perked up, his body trembled with the effort. And then, for the first time in years, he ran. Part 4. The Reunion. Buddy's legs were not as strong as they once were, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. His heart raced, his paws stumbled slightly, but he kept going. His tail wagged wildly, his eyes locked on the figure approaching from the distance. Tommy had stopped in his tracks. At first, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The dog, old, frail, but unmistakably Buddy, was running toward him. His breath caught in his throat, his hands trembled.
"Buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. Then louder, "Buddy!"
Buddy let out a weak but joyful bark, the sound carrying through the air like an echo of all the years they had lost. Tommy dropped to his knees just in time for Buddy to reach him. The old dog nearly collapsed into his arms, panting heavily, his body exhausted from the effort but filled with pure joy. Tommy wrapped his arms around Buddy, pressing his face into the familiar golden fur, now speckled with white. Tears streamed down his face.
I'm so sorry, Buddy, Tommy whispered. I never stopped thinking about you. I should have come back sooner.
Buddy licked Tommy's face as if to say, I never stopped waiting for you. The town had changed in 10 years, but some things had remained the same. Mrs. Miller, now older, stood at the doorway of her bakery, watching the reunion with tears in her eyes. He waited for you, she murmured softly, shaking her head. All these years, he never gave up. Tommy ran his hands over Buddy's red bandana, the same one he had tied around his neck all those years ago. It was faded and frayed, but still there, just like Buddy.
Come on, Bud, Tommy said gently. Let's go home.
Buddy wagged his tail weakly, nuzzling against Tommy's chest. For the first time in a decade, he didn't have to wait anymore. Part 5. Home at last. The drive back home was quiet, except for the soft panting of Buddy, curled up in the passenger seat beside Tommy. Tommy had planned to stay in town for only a short visit, but now he knew he couldn't leave again. Buddy had spent his whole life waiting for him. Now it was Tommy's turn to stay. At home, Tommy laid out a soft blanket near the fireplace, gently helping Buddy settle down. He stroked the old dog's fur, whispering promises he would never break again.
You're home now, Buddy, he murmured. Forever.
Buddy let out a deep, content sigh, resting his head against Tommy's lap. The years of waiting had finally come to an end. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky in warm hues of gold and pink, just like the morning of the day they had parted.
But this time, there were no goodbyes.
Only the quiet, unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog, a bond that had stood the test of time, a bond that would never fade.